to all of you oh, now is a good time to start. Massive congratulations to all of you for reaching the final in the debating league. I'm looking forward to some great speeches and to a fantastic debate to judge. Speeches will be 7 minutes, as you all know. First minute and last minute protected. I'll give timestamps in the chat. And yes, my name is Calix. I'll be chairing this debate, and judging with me will be.
Yeah. So, okay, I'll just quickly start again. Welcome everyone to the finals of Indian Debating League. Thank you so much, Calix, for being generous enough in starting. But yeah, I do need to introduce you formally. So here we go. I am Devika Khanna and I will be moderating this round. We have 3-member panel comprising the chair, that is Calix Puker, and the 2 panelists, Abhilash and Nate. We are so glad to have you on board with us. And coming on to the educator's introduction for the day, which is Calix Puker. So Calix has been a big name in the debating circuit. He has been the ESL Grand Finals, WDC 2020. He has also been in the quarterfinals, EUDC 2019, and ESL quarterfinals, EUDC 2018. Calix has judged more than 15 plus tournaments, Bad Berlin Pro 2018, etc., etc. Calix studied politics and economics at the University of Potsdam, and he is a member of the Berlin Debating Union. Thank you so much, Calix, for joining us today, along with Nate and Abhilash. Okay, so we have Team Haryana and Delhi with us today from the grade category 10 to 12. The motion for this round is, this House as India will discontinue its oil import from Russia on Western advice. Now, quickly understanding why this motion has been picked up for the finals. So India is caught between the devil and the deep sea in the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war. On one hand, it's our obligation to stand against the violation of human rights in Ukraine, while on the other hand, Russia is an important strategic partner, the antagonization of which can cause the people of the country in the long term. This motion is to decide the ideal pathway which India can and should undertake. Each speech is going to be for 7 minutes and the reply speech is going to be for 3 minutes each. The speakers may ask POI. No POI is taken in the first and the last minute of the speeches, and the preference of the POI can be verbal or in the chat box indicated by the speaker before they start with their speeches. Moving further, I would just like to quickly iterate few ground rules. So I request all the debaters to please turn on their camera while debating and throughout the debate, because this will be considered for evaluation as part of manner. All right, for timekeeping, your educator will guide you how they're going to be keeping up with the time. Once you hear the time up sound, you will be having 15 seconds to wrap up your entire argument. Any argument presented beyond that time would not be considered. Thirdly, most important, please do not exceed your time limit, and the feedback and the verdict will be shared in the closing ceremony and not immediately after the debate. So Calix, sir, please indicate how you are going to keep up the time as you educate. Yeah, and with that said, I would now like to hand over the room to you, Calix, sir. All the very best.
All right. Again, my name is Calix. I'll be giving you timestamps in chat. So after the first minute, you'll see a 1 there. That means from that point on, you can ask your questions if the speakers are willing to take them. And when I type in the 6, that's the point where no longer you can put in any questions. Yes. So without any further ado, my panel has been introduced. I've got very capable help this round, and now I would like to welcome the Prime Minister to open the speech that stands in their name. Here. And this is my clapping, by the way, just a little online debating convention.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Great. So I'll start on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. It is said that if we find all our answers in our history, if only we pay enough attention to it. Remember Mahabharat, the great war between the Pandavas and the Kauravas? I'd like to begin by reminding everyone that in spite of Kauravas being his cousins, Krishna chose the Pandavas only because he knew that they were morally just and fair. With that thought, greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and to the House at large. The motion tabled before the House today is that this House, as India, will discontinue its oil import from Russia on Western advice. Whenever I think of a motion, I weigh it on three parameters. Is it the right thing to do? Is it going to benefit the society? And will it stand the test of time? The burden then on my side of the House is to prove 1. Clarify India's stand on the ongoing Russo-Ukrainian war. Second, explain why it is in the best interests of India to discontinue its oil imports from Russia. Third, justify a stand on moral, economic, and political factors. And fourth, and lastly, to propose an alternative solution regarding the same. However, before delving deeper into the different facets of this debate, which is quite complex in nature, let's deconstruct the motion. The Russo-Ukrainian war is a massive man-made and unnecessary tragedy in a world that's doused in unavoidable suffering and destruction. It's launched by nuclear power against one of its largest neighbors, a country for over 40 million with which it shares its elements of history, culture, and family. More than 3.7 million people in Ukraine have been forced out of their homes in the ongoing war. The office of the OHCHR verified a total of 6,940 civilian deaths during the Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Of them, 403 were children. In such times, it becomes imperative for India to take a strong stand as well as action on this matter before it leads to the advent of another world war. This continuing oil imports from Russia thus helps in future energy independence, wherein Russia is exploiting this energy dependency for geopolitical purposes, and the ones majorly impacted by it are the developing countries, which are our primary stakeholders. It's also necessary to understand that what if tomorrow Russia gets upset with us because of some other reason? They'll always have leverage over us. It is rightly said that the aggressor will not stop the debate how it's economically beneficial for India to buy oil from Russia at the discounted rates it's offering. But however, I'd like to remind the opposition, deals like this are often short-lived. They lack the deep liquidity, and without liquidity, trade shrivels up. Discontinuation of imports acts as that force. Before moving further, I'd like to clarify that by doing so, India does not wish to go against the Russian Federation, but rather opposes the decision taken by the current Russian leadership. We respect the long-standing friendship we've had with Russia, but I'd like to remind the opposition that only a true friend opposes when a person fails to follow the right path. That's what the government proposes on doing. Living in the country of the great leader Mahatma Gandhi, whose very principle was non-violence, how can we not condemn a country that is responsible for the loss of and destruction of several million lives? I'll take the POI.
Do you think that Russian citizens and Putin are going to continue having good relationships with India at the point at which India stops buying oil from Russia?
I believe that civilian relationships amongst each other are not dependent on how governments have relations with each other. Take, for instance, the example of India and Pakistan. Civilians in India and Pakistan have great relationships with each other. However, it is not the same for the governments of both the countries. Moving forward, as I was saying, take, for instance, what if tomorrow China invades India? Wouldn't we want countries to think apart from their vested economic and political interests? The opposition needs to remember that in politics, no one stays in the same position for long. So tomorrow it might be us who are in peril. Now let's quickly go over what our side of the House proposes instead. In doing so, I'd firstly like to clear out that this discontinuation will simply act as a stopgap arrangement from our side, which means now, we are simply asking Russia to correct its ways. And if it does do that, there is always a possibility of us reestablishing trade in such a scenario. Now, how do we plan on sustaining ourselves if we do discontinue oil imports from Russia? It's quite simple, actually. The strategy is multifold in nature. It includes short-term and long-term planning both. 1, we diversify our import sources. That is, we consider purchasing the fuel from Guyana, Canada, Gabon, Brazil, and Colombia, and so on and so forth, all Western countries, especially knowing that the world's most populous country sources 52.7% of its oil imports from the Middle East and not Russia, which comes on the third or fourth position. This should not be as hard. Second, exploring alternative sources of energy, which in the longer run might prove to be more eco-friendly and could revolutionize the world of industries as we know them. Panel, I'd also like to reaffirm that the motion lays emphasis on Western advice simply so because the West realize the kind of harm this war has caused all over the world. This is also to clarify that we do understand that the West also has its own vested interests in this, and that the Indian government is not intimidated by any US sanctions or any other sort of force. Now, at some point of the debate, the opposition will put forward the apparent issue of India's foreign policy being one of non-alignment, and therefore the discontinuation of any such imports as India taking the side of one superpower over the other. Now, before they completely mislead us into believing this misguided fact, I'd like to present before the panel a comprehensive definition of what non-alignment really means for a nation. It's easier to define the non-alignment movement in terms of what it's not. It's not about being the member of an alliance. The policy of staying away should not be considered as isolationism or neutrality. Non-aligned states, including India, can and have always been involved in trying to end wars and have worked to prevent wars between others. Hence, in spite of being a non-aligned country, it's of utmost importance that India takes a strong stand on this matter. Politically, too, this is beneficial because it allows India to act as a mediator, because it allows India to mediate between the forces of NATO and Russian leadership and improve, and to an extent even dominate, the global politics. This is what my second and third speakers will elaborate further on. With that, I'd like to end my speech and say that I stand strongly against the motion and for humanity. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Now I'd like to welcome the Leader for Opposition to the front here.
Am I audible?
Yes.
All right, I'll begin. Just give me a second. Yeah. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel. India as an actor in this debate has three major interests. Firstly, economical, to have the best possible deal for trade and maintain economic prosperity. Secondly, geopolitical, to have the best geopolitical stability and connections. And thirdly, political, to have the best political outcomes and strong allies. And all of these will show you through our constructors are best fulfilled on our side of the wall. And that is why we're very proud to oppose. What is our stance in this debate? Three things. Firstly, we continue the policy of non-alignment and have a neutral position, which has political benefit for us, as we'll show you. Secondly, we continue to buy oil from Russia at the best negotiated price. And thirdly, it is important to know that we do not agree to the humanitarian crisis, and India has constantly been pushing for a ceasefire, as PM Modi has also expressed anguish over the humanitarian crisis. But before I get into my constructors, I'll get to some rebuttals of the first PM speaker. There are three major things that came out with the speech. The first is about moral justice. I have three major rebuttals for that. Firstly, putting sanctions and not buying oil from the Russia would actually not do anything to help or the world, because as we have seen throughout the world, it doesn't actually do much. Secondly, EU, the European Union, is doing the exact same thing. It is buying tons of gas from Russia. And thirdly, even on the principal level, India has a greater obligation to its citizens than it has to any other nation whatsoever. Second thing that it came from us is that it could politically have a mediator, which is extremely untrue. Because here's the deal. When you actually go ahead and say, okay, we're not going to be buying oil from Russia anymore because of Western advice, you indirectly just say that, oh, we're not supporting Russia anymore because Russia doesn't need India, India needs Russia. And when you do not have that mutual trust where you go ahead and buy oil from Russia, you automatically have a Western side front, and where you cannot act as a mediator whatsoever, and you're automatically with the Western front, which will show you how that's particularly bad. More importantly, what they said is that when China invades, no one stays in the same political position ever. I like use their words against them. Because yes, no one stays in their political position same, and that is why it is important for India to take a neutral stance. Because once it goes ahead and they're actually allied with a particular country, it puts us in a political hegemony. Now, in the US, and it also talks about China invading, and that is why it's so important for it to maintain ties with both US and Russia. We'll show you how we're going to be doing that. Um, Now, three major points that we'll be proposing to you. Firstly, about the long-term benefits. Secondly, about obligation to its citizens. And thirdly, about the short-term benefits. Firstly, about the long-term benefits. Let's look at two major blocks that there are in this debate. First is US. Now, it's important to know that US support to India is going to remain constant on a pragmatic level because of three major reasons. Firstly, US's greatest threat is China, and its threat to China outweighs anything ever. And these two countries, US and China, are polar opposite. And the recently formed Quad as an alliance against China, India is the only member sharing an actual border with China. So politically, US with its threat against China would not want to isolate India as its strategic partner in its conflict against China. Moreover, economically as well, India is a huge strategic economic partner for the US. Many major US companies consider India a very critical market, like Google. So both economically, politically, strategically, US would not, even when we continue buying oil, will continue to support India and would not want to isolate it and support it in the India-China conflict. Now, secondly, let's talk about Russia as an actor, right? Now, Russia will most likely not support India anymore if we stop buying oil and give in to the Western demands. Note crucially that while India needs Russia because of its resources and oil, because India does not have that oil resources as a developing country, and its current needs are of that oil. Russia doesn't particularly need India, right? Because the only thing that India is doing right now is just increasing its influence, but once it's gone, it doesn't really need India. Now, what Russia is going to do, in fact, is Russia will not support India in the UN, and when in the past it has vetoed several resolutions of the West against India, it's not going to do that anymore. But more importantly, it will hurt the strategic connection that India has with Russia against China and Pakistan. Because once we lose Russia's support, China becomes a huge threat, as now Russia is backing both of these countries in the conflict against India and also funding it. Let's compare both of these situations, the West and Russia. All southeastern countries are currently importing oil from Russia. Now, Western pressure is on all of them. It's not going to ruin the relationship with the entirety of Southeast, right? It's a diplomatic bluff. So West, and even if they do something, they cannot do much. Russia, on the other hand, doesn't need India. And as oil is also being exported to several other countries. So Putin can make decisions erratically, and India would be in a geopolitical crisis with Russia strongly backing both Pakistan and China. Before I move on, any viewers? Seeing none, I'll move on. Second point, obligation. Yes, go ahead.
Right. So the POI being that understanding that Russia and Indian relationships in regards to military weapons is basically trade. Why would this necessarily discontinue? Understanding that Russia would necessarily require this trade, and why would then it not
yes,
as in the situation of
so
China?
here's the thing: we have given you clear strategy that Russia doesn't need India, and India needs Russia. And once we actually go ahead and make this alliance with Western, it's going to particularly hurt India in the UN and also its conflict against China and Pakistan. Secondly, about obligation to its citizens, Jaishankar said that what India imports from Russia in a month, Europe imports in an afternoon. EU still imports ton from Russia, which is very hypocritical. And secondly, this import of Russian oil cannot be a tipping point in the West. And more importantly, this is very crucial to note: India putting the sanctions would not do anything for the sake of the war. But even in our worst case, India as a country, as an actor in this debate, has the greatest obligation, has the greatest principal obligation to its citizens more than any other country, right? More than any other nation. It has a primary obligation to its citizens. As a country, it has a primary objective to its country, as Jaishankar said, that as the world's third largest consumer of oil and gas, a consumer where levels of incomes are not very high, there's a fundamental obligation where levels of income are not very high. It's a fundamental obligation that Indian consumers have access to the best possible oil and gas, because it's very also important to note that when oil prices increase, the rest of the goods prices also increase, and government needs to make sure that its economy and citizens are boosting. Very crucially, also noting that developed countries face this brunt of higher oil prices, but developing country like India, where incomes are so less, cannot, where the rest of the goods prices depend on these oil prices. Now, what would giving into these demands do for India? Two things. It will show weakness. Why? Domestically, Indian government is seen as weak because it does not care about its citizens enough to actually make a strategically smart decision, but also internationally, because West will think that it's easy to get India to bend down to their will. Therefore, India at present, with a neutral position, stands on a safe diplomatical pedestal wherein it deals with both the blocs effectively by being an influential voice on the global diplomacy map while protecting its own national interest at the same time. The world needs India more so than ever, as much as India needs the world. And that is why I'm very proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to I remind every speaker that from 7:15 onwards, we can't write down any more of your arguments. So roughly the last minute, unfortunately, was out of time. Around like 40 seconds-ish. Okay, then without any further ado, I'd like to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Right, I'll be starting in 30 seconds. Right, I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. Good evening, everyone. As side proposition second speaker, first I will be offering some rebuttals to what the leader of opposition has said. Right. First of all, the speaker comes here and talks about how US support is constant to India, but I would just like to remind her that it's not, especially with regards to Pakistan. Now, if we talk about the Kashmir issue specifically, then Pakistan and India already have an ongoing conflict. And we saw that even September, USA was providing them with not just military support, but also F-16 fighter planes that Pakistan could use against India. So we can't say that US support is completely unconditional for India wherever it goes. So that is rebutted. Next, we come on to how they talk about how Russia will not support India in the UN if you do this. First of all, I would just like to state that what the opposition plans on doing here is walking on eggshells around Russia just so that they can get support from one nation. Now, what we need to really understand here is that we need to disapprove of this war that Russia is waging, right? We can't just say that for only India's interest, we'll be completely okay with the humanitarian crisis in Russia, and that is not our obligation. I'll also be rebutting the greatest, Now I'll also be rebutting how she talked about that the Indian government owed the greatest obligation to citizens of India, and that's fundamental. Completely agreed. But what we need to understand is what this will mean for India in the future, right? Like I already said, if there's a conflict in the future where Indian citizens thereby are directly affected, and if other nations just say, well, oh, you didn't help Ukraine when Russia waged a war on them, why should we help you with your fascist problems, your fascist regimes? Then where would India be standing? Absolutely nowhere, right? Also, I would just like to state that though we might have a strategic alliance with Russia at this point of time, which we do completely agree, we are not, first of all, completely negating that, since we are not stopping in our trade of military appliances with them, which is, by the way, a two-way trade. And secondly, I'm not now, please. All right. And secondly, like I said, first of all, we're not going to be stopping trade in military appliances. And secondly, actually, Russia does need India. And that can be seen by the fact that it has offered oil in discounted prices. That means that these sanctions that all of the European countries and USA have been placing on Russia indeed has been working. That's why it is offering oil at such discounted prices. It's taking an opportunity that it can grab, right? Now, India for it at this point of time is a narrowed down market, right? So what we're exactly looking at here is if India does show its disapproval of this entire Russia-Ukrainian war by not taking oil for some amount of time, what this will really indicate, first of all, to the Western Bloc, that not that we are going to be begging, not that we are going to be falling at the Western Bloc's feet, but rather that we are against basic humanitarian crises and basic.
POI.
Yes, I'll take that POI.
Given the US and a lot of the Western countries have committed a lot of atrocities, such as Afghanistan, would you say that India should stop trading with the US as well and stop buying oil from the US as well?
Right. So now let's see what exactly we have at the motion at hand right now, right? Now, the humanitarian crisis in Russia is something that has been directly inflicted by Russia on Ukraine. Like we talk about the Afghanistan crisis, it's completely different. It's about terrorism, it's about the Taliban, it's about US, and it can be seen in various different hues, right? So you might say that the US is pulling out of Afghanistan, but you also might say that the US is, well, it did reflect a humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, but it was doing that because of Taliban control in the first place. So it can't be directly equated to this scenario at any point of time, right? Now I'll be talking about my arguments that I'll be continuing as a second speaker. Right. So our first argument that I would like to extend upon, that the first speaker had already talked about, was how this will actually incentivize certain people, certain businessmen in India to go for green technology now, right? Now, what the government has been talking about for a very long time, especially in India, is the perfect opportunity to become self-sufficient. Let's take an example. Let's take a scenario, right? Now, this recent energy crisis that Europe is facing, that happened because Russia suddenly stopped its gas exports to Europe. Now, what if suddenly, due to a change in political state, it stops gas exports and oil exports to India as well. Now, what happens in this scenario? We don't have energy security. Now, why is this so imperative? Why is energy security so imperative? Mainly because, well, if, for example, right now we rely on Russia for 80% of our oil and our gas, right? So if that continues, and if we keep relying on them for that amount of oil and gas, then what inherently we'll be looking for is we'll be economically dependent on Russia. But if we completely negate Russian oil for at least some time now, what we will see is that we will be looking to diversify to different nations, right? Like the first speaker had also mentioned. Secondly, we'll be looking to make ourselves more self-sufficient. Let me remind everyone that Atmanirbhar Bharat also looks at making India as fuel efficient as possible. And that is exactly what we'll be doing on our side of the house, right? Not taken, thank you. Right, and like I'd already said, green technology would also be benefited. So that's an added benefit that India will be facing, right? Now, argument number 2 will be about how, I'll be just elaborating on the humanitarian aspect of it again. Now, saying that the cost of oil, the cost of discounted oil is something that you'll be valuing more than the cost of lives in Ukraine is something that I think is very, well, inhumane per se of the opposition to say, because, well, in the end, what you need to understand is that India is part of a global community. You can't just say that as India is the actor, we'll only be looking at Indian citizens, right? We need to be looking at the global community at any point of time, right? Now, what we'll also be talking about is another rebuttal, actually, to what the opposition had said, where they said that we won't be taking a neutral stance in this occasion by completely blocking off Russian oil. I would just like to reiterate the fact that, as the first proposition speaker had also said, we will in fact be taking a neutral stance. We'll be taking a stance against war. We'll be taking a stance for the people, for the citizens of a global community, rather than just walking on eggshells around Russia only because we think it might just support us in the UN and it might just support us geopolitically. Let me remind everyone here that the Western Bloc also has a lot of large nations and a lot of powerful nations, and that the world is not just restricted to Russia and India, but Western nations also. Seeing that my time is up, I will conclude. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Now I'd like to welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition, Here.
Yes, just give me 30 seconds.
Sure.
Okay, yes. Before I start my speech, I would like to make sure I'm clearly audible and visible.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So, good evening to the house at, I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Good evening to the House at large today. As the DLO in today's speech, I shall be doing 3 things in my speech. Firstly, rebutting the previous speaker. Secondly, reconstructing our case. And thirdly, giving out our third constructive. Coming to the rebuttals. Now, the proposition today has come up and talked a lot about the moral stance, about not supporting war, and about this whole conflict being about not supporting war and how our side is actually supporting the war. Well, let's just look at the topic again. In the topic, we're talking about the debate in terms of, by the lens of India, and therefore the main stakeholders automatically become the citizens in the government of India. So if we talk about a moral stance, then let's just look at our own country. It's probably going to have worse impacts on our own citizens, which I will talk about later in my speech, right? They even talked about how true friends will tell, we're such, they talked about our foreign policy and how we have a long-lasting relationship, and therefore this step would actually be a benefit in our relationship. But how's not that we're talking about relations at an international sphere over here, and this is a discussion between two countries, not a civilian argument. Therefore, this whole argument of a moral stance that they seem to be taking is not really real, right? Then they talk about how this will not lead to an increased Western dependence. But this is exactly something that I'll be talking about in my speech. They tell us in this hypothetical situation about how this doesn't actually lead us into a high Western dependence. But if we draw this thing, Russia as a major importer, then it's likely to lead us to taking the oil and compensating for it via Western countries. I'll take that later, right? Thirdly, the proposition has led this debate into a very hypothetical situation about countries changing their political stances, right? That just diverts the debate from the real burden of in which world does India benefit more long and short term. And this again will be something that I discuss in my speech. But House, please note that even becoming independent in such a scenario is a very slow process inherently. Now that we're done with the rebuttal, let's move on to the reconstruction. Panel in brief, we presented two arguments. The first one being about long-term benefits. I will not delve into this much because the first speaker has already done that, but essentially we tell you that in the case of India continuing imports with Russia, there are likely to be no consequences that we face from Western countries. And we've told you this continuously, and we've established this continuously, that we're not going to face consequences, because EU, if we do face consequences, it's going to be hypocritical, because EU itself also takes a lot of oil imports from Russia, and therefore it does not make sense. Now our side asserts this, as we explained to you, how we even tell you that in the proposition's case of stopping Russian imports, there are likely to be consequences like broken ties and tariffs implemented. Then we come to our second constructive, which I will extend on, about the obligation towards citizens. House note, these are the main stakeholders, and therefore this argument stands in this debate. In this, we establish a clear narrative about how such a move creates a zone of weakness for India. We tell you that this move not only deems India as a country that is easily influenced and obedient to the West, but also how inside our country the government credibility is likely to drop marginally. Once the people understand that the government is at such a vulnerable stance to the West and assert no dominance, our own people are likely to question the power of the government. House note that the topic, again, is debated through the eyes of the country of India, and therefore the most important stakeholders are automatically the citizen and the government. Why this constructive on the obligation to citizens? We tell you exactly how the after effects of such a move will lead us into a spiraling downfall of dispute between the country's people and the country's authority. That brings me to our third argument about the direct short-term consequences that India faces via such a move. And this is something that the proposition should definitely note, because it has a lot of rebuttals to their case. Let us now come to the proposition's house and look at how things end up in their best case scenario if we implement such a move. The first most obvious impact would be the citizen suffering as Russia pulls out as one of the major oil importers in the country. What happens next? Well, there is oil inflation. The petrol and diesel rate, which has been affordable for so long due to the Russian import, now becomes expensive, and at the end of the day, our major stakeholders are left in a bad position. House note that if the proposition even implies that we would be able to compensate for such losses, then that line of argument is striked out from this debate. This is why oil inflation is something that developed countries deal with easily. However, India being a developing one with Russia as a major importer is very difficult for the loss to be compensated for. This is exactly where we come back to the whole argument about Western dependence. Let's say we did compensate for all of this loss, but we would be at the knees of the Western countries, because At this point, we're compensating only through their resources. Secondly, as an extension to the second argument, with a move like this, there's likely to be unrest among the citizens and authorities in our country. The BJP government, as said by the first speaker, came into power by propagating a very nationalistic agenda and scheme, and hence this move will be extremely contradictory to all that they promote. Lastly, on the proposition side, after such a policy, there's likely to be retaliatory tariffs that Russia and China asserts on our country that again demote any progress, demote the progress rate of our country, and are likely to also directly hit the economic development of our country. House, on our side of the house, we tell you that even if our worst case, even in our worst case scenario of not stopping the oil import, there is likely to be no consequence that we face from the Western countries. We create a country that actually helps and protects the citizens' welfare. This brings me to the conclusion. Panel, we've told you how this move in an all-round analysis is one that has more cons than pros. We tell you how the first, second, and the third set of stakeholders in this debate today not only face hardships but are also put into a permanent risk future. Further, we take the proposition's case and prove to you how even in front of that best case, our worst case is likely to be more beneficial and inherently secure for the stakeholders. Therefore, we also stand at a diplomatic position and hold an influential role, therefore not losing the credibility of our country. And therefore, we believe that this house must continue oil importing from Russia. Now that I have time left, I will be willing to take a POI. Please go ahead.
All right. Why would necessarily Russia still not provide help, to India in case we do imply oil imports, understanding that they are in alliance with China continuously?
Can you repeat that question again?
Understanding that Russia has a very strong alliance with China, why would they, even in your best case scenario, help us in a case of a conflict?
What we're actually trying to assert over here is the fact that if you pull Russia out as a major importer of oil, India just leads into more of a dependence policy, right? So that actually proves the point that Russia helps our country in the oil importing, and we don't actually want to fall into a Western dependence stance. I think my time's up now, so thank you and very proud to propose.
All right, thank you very much. Now I'd like to welcome the first whip speaker, Pozert government. Here.
I'll just take 30 seconds to gather minutes.
All right. Oh, and small reminder, after the 6th minute, you can't offer any POIs. This time was slightly over. I let it happen, it's all right. But please do be aware of protected time.
Right. I'll be taking my POIs in the chat. Thank you very much. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I'll be doing 3 things in my speech panel. I'll be pointing out the 3 main clashes that have happened in the debate till now. First being in regards to neutrality. Second being India's relation with Russia and what are the incentives that we do or not. And thirdly, in regards to the impact of the public at large. First, in regards to neutrality, note that the main issue with the characterization that side opposition has done till now is that they've majorly rebutted their own points, right? So when the first opposition goes ahead and says that how India's policies need to be more neutral, they end up becoming not neutral in the rest of the arguments. When they try to propagate the idea of, let's say, some sort of a bias towards Russia, they do understand and they do undermine the idea of neutrality at large. And that's why I first proposition already told you that the very policy of neutrality that started in the 1950s and the 1960s in the Indian foreign policy is something that cannot be continued till now and thus needs to be modified. And what is the modification that we already explained to you? The modification that we told you was that we would not be impacted by the decisions or by the policies of other foreign countries. Rather, we would have a much more humanitarian approach, and we would try to consider India's foreign policy as first and foremost, right? Understanding this very same thing, note that how this is something that we've already maintained on our side of the house. We need to do this in order to maintain economic dependency, in order to maintain the fact of economic independency in regards to not taking all our oil imports from Russia, but rather to make sure that our oil imports are much more diverse in nature and not over an act that is actually cruel in the current scenario. But also note that how even in their side of the house, when they end up letting oil imports come into India, aren't they also getting dependent upon the idea of the fact that Russia is somewhere dominating the foreign policy? Isn't that also somewhere failing the idea of NAM in every form whatsoever? What side opposition does then is lacking characterization about what exactly neutrality ends up doing and what exactly neutrality looks like in the current scenario, rather than what India would have made neutrality look like in the 1950s or the 1960s, right? But even in the worst case scenario, let's just presume that neutrality is the worst thing in forever. The current model that we've already proposed to you, the model in which we're basing a policy upon the idea of this one particular country, basing a policy independently rather than based upon this one particular country, aren't we also in a scenario wherein we're actually trying to engage with these global actors? That is to say, India right now, to become a global actor, to become a global power, superpower, needs to engage with other countries, needs to actually start becoming a part of major conflicts, to become a mediating power in order to shine as not only one country that can stand as a counter-attack to China in the subcontinent, right? Because right now our power and our role for the West has been reduced to that only. To enhance our role in this scenario then is to act as a mediating power, and is to act as a power that can actually ensure major inflows of information and probably mediation laws between these two groups, which is something that can only happen on our side of the house, a characterization of which that was already provided by my first speaker. We're still unclear as to how and why this will occur on side opposition. How are we acting as a global superpower on side opposition? Very, very proud to propose on this. Secondly, coming over to the second clash in regards to relations with Russia. Two main issues with this clash, right? Firstly, we're unclear as to why Russia would still continue to help us in the case of China, understanding that they already characterize this as one of the most important arguments and one of the most important things, right? Because two reasons to this. First is Russia is in very close ties with China, and Russia would simply, if had to choose between the two, choose a superpower that can actually help them much more economically as well, right? But secondly, even in the best case scenario, right? Like even if Russia starts to help us in the case of China, understand that the help of the Western Bloc is overpowering the help that Russia would probably provide, because the Western Bloc's help is coming into two main conflicts, that is Kashmir as well as China. In this scenario, then the Western Bloc is able to help us not only in military, something that Russia can already do, but so can the Western Bloc. The Western Bloc can also provide us with much more political support in the United Nations and in various other UN organs as that. Russia, on the other hand, does have that vote in the UNSC, but so does the other three countries that are present in the Western Bloc. This means that Russia right now currently doesn't have any political leverage over India at the current moment. Even they would not like to discontinue military trade, understanding that this military trade is essential for their own economy to run, understanding that their market right now is narrowed down. What does this look like? This looks like various countries not wanting to trade with Russia, understanding its actions in various scenarios whatsoever, understanding the sanctions that have been imposed, and thus Russia only having India or various few other countries to actually export to. In this scenario, Russia is most likely to still export military weapons, so even that one particular negation that they had is falling down. But even in the best case, right, let's say Russia does not do anything of this sort, like Russia is in any way whatsoever not able to provide us any sort of help, understand the very scenario that they're then proposing over here, right? The fact that India is standing at a power hold, at a power position wherein it is able to refuse the help of a superpower, that in itself is a statement panel. Understand that their entire argument about how we are not ensuring power, we are ensuring the idea, or let's say India being pushed under the leverage of a particular superpower, it falls entirely blank, right? Understanding that India then has the capacity to say no to this entire superpower and alliance that it has been running for a while, right? This then looks like India trying to prioritize relations which would provide much more political help, economic help equal to Russia and equal to what Russia would have provided, probably more. But also thirdly, India ensuring that it has a power statement over there as well. We feel that that is not an impact, that is not a benefit that they can take away from us, which is actually much more certified on our side of the house. Before that, POI.
Yeah, so West has actively, as you've already said in your speeches, has actively sided with Pakistan. So how is the West going to particularly help us in the India-Pakistan conflict?
Right, understand that how it is easier for us to negotiate over this particular thing with the West rather than Russia. That is to say, even in the best case scenario, even if Pakistan, even in the issue of Pakistan, if the West sides with Pakistan at the current moment, which it doesn't because it's a neutral stance that they're trying to initiate over here, even if they do so, it is much more easier for us to make the West shift in the current scenario rather than make Russia shift. Russia right now has a particular superpower to cater to, whereas the West in this particular equation doesn't have any superpower to cater to, right? They have Pakistan and India. In this scenario, it is equally as beneficial to them, or probably more to actually support India rather than to support Pakistan. In that scenario, we do win this debate. But thirdly, in regards to impact, note panel that we already gave you all these list of alternatives in regards to all that we would be undertaking in the scenario that we actually stop imports from Russia. This was not rebutted clearly this was not rebutted at all by side opposition, which means that this point clearly stands still. Which means that the entire argument about how we're causing inflation, how this entire scenario of this global public actually not making sure that it has all these benefits is entirely false, because our side of the house is the one that ensures power. Our side of the house is the one that ensures that we have a humanitarian response which aids our issues in various other conflicts such as Pakistan, the Kashmir issue, as well as the Chinese issue. But fourthly and most importantly, panel, we are the side that are ensuring that economic dependency over Russia reduces till an extent that we're able to fulfill our main policies such as Atmanirbhar Bharat, or to make our India a self-reliant nation. Really, really proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to welcome the opposition whip to the front. Here.
Am I audible and visible?
Yes.
I'll just take a moment. Cool. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Proposition wanted to claim that buying oil from Russia will have no impact on Russia and India's relationships, and that it was suddenly the magic book which would stop Russia's war on Ukraine. I think the problem with the proposition is that they never tell us why this is exactly a tipping point, right? We give you several structural reasons why relationships with the West will still remain the same, why the war will still continue. They never bother to rebut that, right? I'll just go through some of the reasons. One, why will relationships still remain the same? Because like India is really strategically and economically, like politically important for the West, because in like context of China and stuff, but then B, like just importing oil is not such a big deal at the point where the EU is still importing oil, right? I just don't see where the tipping point is in this debate. In the absence of that, they cannot hope to take this debate. Secondly, like an entire clash of that third speaker was about neutrality. Like one, I just don't see why it's such a big deal in this debate. Like, sure, I'm going to say if it's better for India, sure, we're not equal. I just don't care. But then two, even like, I do think we're neutral, because I think all countries understand at the point at which you're doing something which is for your own interest. No, thank you. 3 questions then in this debate. Firstly, about principles. Secondly, about relationship, geopolitical. And thirdly, about the likely counterfactual. Let's first go on the likely counterfactual. What did they tell us? They tell us essentially 2 things. They tell us A, you can diversify import sources for energy, but then B, that you can explore alternative sources of energy such as green energy. There's several problems with this. The first thing I want to note is that this doesn't just happen in a short span of time, right? I can't just suddenly set up import agreements for in 1 month with some other countries, right? These things takes years and years to actually happen, to actually materialize, which means in the short term, you're actually going to have far worse, all the impacts we told you, no thank you, all the impacts we told you about inflation, about the common man not being able to buy oil still exists. But then the second thing I want to note is that there's clearly a contradiction in that case, right? At the point where they're saying, oh, we're still going to get energy, but then they're saying, oh, because of this lack of energy, you're going to try to get green energy. I just think that's a contradiction, right? But then two, even if we accept you are able to, no, thank you. Even if we accept you're able to get import sources, one, it's likely to be at higher prices, which is really, really bad for Indian citizens, which I think proposition just fails to notice. This is literally an act of motion, the most important thing in this debate. But then two, we also told you how it's likely to be West-centric, which means you're actually going to have greater dependency on them, on like the West, rather than having it on Russia. Secondly, on their argument about exploring alternative forms of energy. One, I just think that this is largely symmetrical, right? Because there's already a push to move towards green energy because of things like people realizing that like where like the earth is dying, all that kind of stuff. But then two, I think this incentive for green energy exists anyways, because India anyway wants a positive balance of payment, which is essentially India anyway wants to reduce its dependency on Russia. India anyway wants to be self-sustained. So I think this is likely to happen on both sides of the house. What else did they tell us? They tell us, oh, Russia is suddenly exploiting India. Like, no, I think actually India is exploiting Russia because India is getting fuel at an extremely low rate because there's just less demand for Russia's fuel right now, which means that this point just falls completely flat. What do we tell you? We tell you, A, that like now it's really bad for the common citizen, but we also tell you on narratives, right? We tell you internationally there's going to be a loss of reputation. What do they say? They say, oh, like India is able to say they are refusing power from a superpower. Yeah, but then you're literally saying yes to the West, right? You're literally saying that, I fell down to the knees of the West and I've like succeeded and I've given up all my power to them because I need to do whatever they say. I want to note that this is far, far worse because for the common citizen agreeing to the West, because of things like colonialism, which means that Indians are like, we see the West as this dominant force which is looking to take over India. Secondly, on domestically, we tell you that like for the Indian government, this is likely to be really, really bad because now you can have a loss of faith in like BJP because stuff of things like they came into power on a nationalist agenda, all that kind of stuff, right? What did they tell us? They tell us, now we think that you've bowed out to Russia. Like one, we're just continuing an already happening process. This is not the case. But then two is literally in the best interest of the people, right? I literally fail to see how this point materialized. I'll take a POI now.
Right. Understanding that if India is exploiting Russia, how does Russia ensure any leverage over India? Understanding that it won't be able to help us in the China issue, but you haven't talked about the Pakistan and the Kashmiri issue yet.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I was literally getting to that, my geopolitical. But yes, I think that's literally the point where India will help us in the China issue, because we're the only buyers of Russian oil, like whatever, like we buy Russian oil, so they're likely to help us. Okay, secondly, on geopolitical issues, we tell you that now that relationships with the West are likely to remain the same, but relationships with Russia is likely to deteriorate because one, Putin is not like logical, which means that he's going to make a decision based on emotion. But then two, there's likely to be public sentiment against India for like in Russia at the point at which you're no longer buying oil, right? What this means is that Russian relation will deteriorate, right? What did they tell us? They tell us, it's anyway bad because Russia will not support us against China. I think the thing is they will support us against China. I think the reason why China hasn't attacked is in part because of obviously other factors, but also because of the fact that Russia is the only counterbalance against China. The West is really, really far away, which means we can't always rely on them, right? Then they say less support from the West. One, it's difficult for public pressure to actually come against the West in foreign companies at the point at which, like, I think most people in Europe are against the sanctions because it's hurting their life. But then two, I think that like EU still imports more oil from Russia than India does, which means it's incredibly hard for there to be public sentiment against India at the point of which it's hypocritical. But then two, as I told you in my introduction, India is both economically and politically important for the West, which means that you're unlikely to cut ties. But thirdly, we told them in a POI that the West, they themselves consider that the West doesn't help us in Pakistan. How does this change? Why do we want them as a partner? And fourthly, they tell us, it's easy to make the West shift. No, it's easy to make Russia shift because you can say, hey, I'm going to stop importing oil from you if you don't support me. I think that's a far greater leverage. But then fifthly, even in the absolute best case where we say relationship with the West become worse, I think one, with increasing globalization and interdependency, it doesn't really make much of a difference at the point at which trade is still going to happen. You literally can't stop trade. And then two, I think I fail to see why an alliance with Russia is far, far worse. They had to prove that for like for in order for any of the points to fall. Lastly, on principle, what did we tell you? We told you that you have a greater obligation to the citizens, right? Absolutely no response, right? The only response was hinged on the practical benefits that you're going to get energy dependency and all that kind of stuff. That isn't start. One, I think it's important to note that you already showed disapproval, right? India's already stated that against the humanitarian crisis, that against this humanitarian like exploitation, all that kind of stuff, which means you're already showing disapproval and actually fulfilling that principal duty. But then too, there's a problem solution mismatch, because like it's not going to stop the war, right? They haven't told us why simply not buying oil is going to stop the war. We gave you several reasons, but then lastly, I think there's a contradiction in that case insofar as they still want to trade with Russia on other matters. That principle doesn't stand. Also, we pointed out in a POI, well, then don't trade with like half the world, don't trade with China, don't trade with US because of the atrocious thing they've done. That just shows how absurd that principle is. But then lastly, we're okay to weigh this off, right? For all these reasons, incredibly proud to oppose.
All right, thank you very much. Now I'd like to welcome the first reply speaker for side opposition again to the front. Here, to close the side, the case for side opposition.
Audible and visible.
Sorry? Oh, and speeches are 3 minutes long.
Yeah, am I audible and visible?
Yes, yes, you are.
All right, I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, please note the claims that side proposition has made, right? Firstly, India is going to become a superpower by giving into West's demand, right? Secondly, India is going to suddenly be so independent that it's not going to face any economical crisis whatsoever. These are the absurd expectations that proposition has from this. They tell us about modification. They never tell us how is it going to help India, how is it going to politically garner support, and how is it economically actually beneficial. They think that just because we give in to the West's demands, we can now have so much leverage over the West to actually make them, to an extent, make them a superpower and support them against Pakistan. Now let's just, I'll two key questions then. Firstly, who principally wins this debate? Secondly, who pragmatically wins this debate? Firstly, let's talk about who pragmatically wins this debate. Now, firstly, we already tell you that US would be constant because of several economical strategic reasons. And first, they come up here and say that, oh, it's not going to support us against Pakistan. Well, that's going to happen on your side of the world as well. Then why are we even aligning with them in the first place if they're not even going to support us against Pakistan? But more importantly, if US would be constant supporter of us, especially in China. We're looking at China as a stakeholder, so US would support us in China in this sort of connection. We're taking our worst case scenario when they don't actually support us in Pakistan. We still say we have such great support of US in China because of US's personal gain from China. Secondly, let's talk about Russia, right? They tell us how we could be independent suddenly because we now are not importing oils. Well, let me tell you about the basics of economics, because that's not how economics works, right? When 80% of India is dependent on Russia, you just cannot at the end of the day just like do not expect an economic crisis by just like withdrawing from import anyway. But more importantly, even in our worst case, let's say we do not get support of Russia in case of China. But more importantly, Russia is a very strategic partner because Russia would not, even though it would not support either China or India, it would not actively like back China, which it will do in your side of the world when we just like simply like refuse and like stop this alliance. So it's going to do. And more importantly, Russia is a very strategic partner in case of Pakistan, because Russia in the first Indo-Pakistan war has also been supporting us, as we've already told in our first speech. So Russia is going to be a strategic alliance in terms of Pakistan, and US is going to be a strategic alliance in terms of China, even in our worst case. So it's going to strategically help India so much to have both these countries in a neutral stance. But more importantly, let's talk about how in a principle level we win this debate, right? Firstly, we tell you that the sanctions don't actually do anything on this. As we've seen throughout the world, it don't actually like do anything on the world. But secondly, the European Union is importing so much gas from the Russian side. This never gets counted on their side of the world, by the way, when they actually talk about how this is going to have they talk about a humanitarian crisis, but don't tell us how this would actually help with the crisis. But thirdly, as India as an actor in this debate, the obligation to its citizens is far more, and it would domestically and internationally ruin India's reputation, and that is why we've clearly won this debate. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Now I'd like to welcome the reply speaker for side proposition to give us the final word, basically. Here.
Am I audible? All right, so I will be starting on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Think about where you want to stand when history books are written at this moment in time. Support for the Russian leadership is support for an invasion that obviously is having a devastating impact. Now, there were 3 clashes mainly that were introduced in the course of this debate. One was regarding the principles or the characterization of the Russo-Ukrainian war being a humanitarian crisis. Second, being on the terms of neutrality. And third, being on how India claims itself to be self-sufficient and independent in terms of oil trade. Talking about the first one, talking about the principles and humanitarian crisis involved, the government whip loudly exclaimed, "I don't care." That's what the world said when Jews were mistreated. "I don't care," and the Holocaust happened. That's what the world said when the Kashmiri Pandits were thrown away from their houses. "I don't care," and the genocide happened. Talking about the leader of opposition speech, the leader of opposition failed to even acknowledge the Russo-Ukrainian war as a humanitarian crisis. I'd like to ask the leader of opposition, how does the murder and the destruction of the lives of thousands and thousands of people not categorized as a humanitarian crisis? Then another inconsistency in the opposition's case is the fact that even though the leader of opposition denied to even acknowledge the war as a humanitarian crisis, the government's whip repeatedly mentioned it as one. So we'd like to ask the opposition to be clear in their stance in the first place. Now, second, talking about neutrality, what proposition is trying to say is trying to help you understand a comprehensive definition of what neutrality means. The definition, what the opposition presented, was shallow and not very well thought of. Now, talking about when they mentioned alliance with the West and putting sanctions on Russia, those are two things which the proposition never, those are two claims that the proposition never made. We simply spoke of a stopgap agreement, an agreement which says that if Russia decides to mend its ways, if Russia decides to stop troubling the civilians present in the area, we will possibly again resume the trades with them. Then next, the deputy leader of opposition mentioned that the alternative solution or the model that the proposition proposed was a slow process. However, she did not counter its effectivity, thus silently agreeing to the fact that our argument is what will, at the end of the day, benefit India the most in the process. Then, talking about the third, the self-sufficiency as well as the independence of India. Well, a few years back, when the oil-producing conglomerate of Middle Eastern regions reduced pumping, and as a result, the cost of barrels turned out to be $100 per barrel, where was Russia then? It did not help us, which means that the fact that we as a country start to depend on Russia is not a solution at all. With that, I'd like to end my speech, and I'd like to stand strongly in favor of the motion and in favor of humanity. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. I want to first of all congratulate every speaker and thank them for wonderful speeches and a great debate. And I would like to now ask everyone but the judges to leave the room. We'll announce the results during the final ceremony at, I think, 8 p.m.
8:30
Indian Standard Time? 8:30, yes. All right. Oh, including the spectators, please.
I'll remove them just a second. And I'll stop recording this.
All right, perfect.